Welcome back, everyone. Ready to tackle another historical enigma.
Always up for a challenge, especially when it involves a figure as intriguing as Socrates.
This guy, he was condemned for being a bit too wise for ancient Athens. How do we even begin to separate the man from the myth? I mean, it's not like we have his diary or anything.
Right, that's the core issue with Socrates. He never wrote a single word himself. Everything we know comes from what others said about him, which makes things pretty tricky.
It's a bit of a historical jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? We've got these pieces from his students like Plato and Xenophon, but then there's Aristophanes, who basically made fun of him in his plays.
It's like trying to understand a modern-day celebrity through, fan blogs and tabloid articles. You get a lot of different perspectives, not all of them accurate.
Exactly. So how do we even know what to trust? I mean, Plato's dialogues are our main source, but could he have, jazzed things up a bit, put his own words into Socrates' mouth?
It's what's known as the Socratic problem. Scholars debate whether Plato's earlier writings are closer to the real Socrates, while his later works might be more like, well, Plato using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own ideas.
So we need our skepticism hats on, especially with those later dialogues. Okay, but then we have Xenophon, who also wrote about Socrates. How does his version compare to Plato's?
It's a bit like comparing a rock concert to a lecture hall. Plato gives you drama, deep philosophical debates. Xenophon is more like, here's Socrates, the war hero, the patriotic Athenian.
To give you a concrete example, you have Socrates debating the meaning of love in Plato's Symposium, and then you have him giving practical life advice in Xenophon's Memorabilia.
Precisely. Talk about different vibes. And then you throw Aristophanes into the mix with his play, The Clouds.
Oh yeah, in The Clouds, Socrates is this kind of bumbling, spacey guy obsessed with weird science stuff. It's almost a caricature, isn't it?
Definitely a caricature, but it tells us something important. Socrates was well known in Athens, even if some people saw him as a bit of an oddball. He definitely made an impression.
So we've got Plato, maybe adding some philosophical spice. Xenophon, maybe toning things down. And Aristophanes, poking fun at him. What solid facts can we agree on about Socrates' life? What's the bedrock truth here?
Despite the variations, some things are consistent. We know he was born in Athens around 470 BC. His father was a stonemason, and his mother, interestingly, a midwife.
That's a cool detail. It's like she helped birth ideas, and he helped birth them in other people's minds.
Exactly. And he served in the Athenian army, showing courage in battle. What's fascinating is that he seems to have been very respectful of Athenian laws and customs, too.
Wait, hold on. This is the guy who questioned everything. How does that fit with respecting authority?
That's the interesting part. He was a patriot, but he was also critical of Athenian society, especially its values. He challenged those values by constantly asking questions, engaging with everyone, from politicians to poets, in these public debates.
Ah, the famous Socratic method. Not just accepting things at face value, but really digging deeper, right?
Picture this. You're at a fancy dinner party, and instead of talking about the weather, you start questioning the very foundations of society. That was Socrates.
So he was this fearless truth seeker, shaking things up. But if he was so respected ethically, why was he put on trial? What happened?
That's the million-dollar question. Officially, he was accused of impiety, basically, not worshiping the Athenian gods in the right way, and of corrupting the youth.
Corrupting them by making them think critically. That seems ironic, considering he believed in Athenian values. There has to be something more to it.
You're picking up on something crucial. We need to factor in the political climate of Athens back then. Remember, they had just lost the Peloponnesian War. Things were unstable.
So tensions were running high. Questioning things could easily be seen as a threat.
Precisely. And Socrates, with his constant questioning and his association with some who had supported the previous regime, well, he became a target.
It seems like philosophy and politics can get really tangled, especially in turbulent times. His trial, as we see in Plato's Apology, must have been quite the spectacle.
It was. In the Apology, Socrates defends himself boldly, arguing that he never meant to corrupt anyone. He saw his mission as a service to Athens. He even compared himself to a gadfly stinging the city to wake it up to its own problems.
And true to form, he refused to back down from his principles, even when he had the chance to escape punishment. That's integrity.
It really is. He accepted his death sentence, something he could have easily avoided, because he believed in obeying Athenian law, even when it was used unjustly against him.
So we've started to understand Socrates' life, his trial, and the context of it all. But what about his actual philosophy? What were the big ideas that made him so revolutionary?
To understand his philosophy, we have to dive into his method. And that, my friend, is a story for another time. Picking up where we left off, to really get Socrates, you have to understand his method. It wasn't about sitting in a classroom taking notes. It was active. It was about getting people to think for themselves.
Yeah, it wasn't about lectures or writing big, complicated books. It was all about dialogue, a real intellectual back and forth. I guess you could even call it a kind of sparring match, where Socrates, through these carefully thought out questions, would kind of expose the holes in his opponent's argument.
Exactly. Imagine yourself going toe-to-toe with Socrates. He starts with these simple-sounding questions, guiding you, maybe you're some hotshot expert, through a line of reasoning.
And before you know it, bam,
Yeah,
you're contradicting yourself, realizing that what you thought you knew for sure is actually, well, not so clear after all.
that's the genius of it. It wasn't about crushing someone in an argument. It was about getting to the bottom of things, making people look inward, question themselves. He called it elenchus. It's like a cross-examination, but for ideas.
So it's not just about asking any old question, is it? It's
Yeah.
about asking the right ones, the kind that make you question everything you thought you knew, even your own biases.
Exactly. He was your intellectual personal trainer, pushing you to your limits. To him, this constant questioning was the only way to get to real knowledge.
But let's be honest, that probably didn't make him very popular, always poking and prodding at people's beliefs, especially those in power.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that went over too well all the time.
Oh, it definitely ruffled some feathers. But for Socrates, truth, especially when it came to ethics, was everything. What does it mean to live a good life? What is justice? What is courage? These weren't just abstract ideas to him. They were real. They were guidelines for how to live.
He wasn't settling for easy answers, was he? He had to dig deep, find definitions that could hold up under pressure.
He wanted them to be rock solid. He believed that understanding these virtues, truly understanding them, was the key to eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia. I've heard that before, but remind me.
We often translate it as happiness or flourishing, but it's bigger than just feeling good. Imagine being in sync with your values, living up to your full potential. That's the idea.
So it's not enough to just know what's right intellectually. You actually have to live it right, make it a part of who you are.
Exactly. He believed if you truly understood good, you would naturally do good. This is his idea of moral intellectualism, a pretty radical concept.
It kind of implies that people only do bad things because they don't understand what good really is.
Yeah, and that's a debate that's gone on for centuries. Does knowledge alone guarantee virtue? What about emotions or things beyond our control influencing our actions? It's tricky.
But you can see his unwavering faith in reason, in people's capacity for good. For him, reason was the compass, guiding us towards knowledge and virtue.
And this faith in reason extended even to his religious beliefs. Now, Socrates was a devout man in his own way, but he questioned the typical stories about the gods, the ones where they act like jealous humans and all that.
He didn't buy into all the drama and mythology then. He saw something more, something deeper in the divine.
Precisely. He believed in a divine force, but felt the best way to connect with it was through philosophy, through thinking, not blind faith.
Which probably didn't make him too many friends in the religious circles of his time. And then there's that thing about his daimonion, that inner voice that guided him. It's almost like, I don't know, a mystical thing, isn't it?
Yeah, the daimonion is fascinating. Picture it as a little voice inside him, a sort of conscience, I guess. It would warn him against doing certain things. Think of it as intuition, but even that intuition was filtered through his reasoning.
So he didn't just blindly obey it. He didn't just give up control to some outside force.
Not at all. He weighed what his daimonion said against his own logic, his own judgments. Even his spiritual experiences were open to debate in his mind. It shows how independent his thinking was, how committed he was to using reason.
Okay, so we have this guy who questioned everything, who was deeply rational, but then there's that famous saying of his, I know that I know nothing. How does that fit in? Was it just him being humble, or was there something more to it?
Another great question that has puzzled people for ages. Some say it was just a clever trick to get people talking, to show them how much they didn't know. Others think he genuinely believed it, that he recognized the limits of human understanding. Like, even the smartest among us know so little in the grand scheme of things.
So he was a master of humility as well as debate. Interesting combo. It's like he's saying real wisdom is about recognizing how much we don't know, about always being curious.
Which brings us to probably his most famous quote, the one everyone remembers, "The unexamined life is not worth living." That's Socrates in a nutshell. It's his challenge to us, urging us to question, to challenge our beliefs, to always strive for a better understanding.
It's a pretty radical idea, though, right? That just going through the motions without really thinking about why is a wasted life. It's a
Mhm.
message that still hits hard even today.
Absolutely. It's more relevant than ever. We live in this world overloaded with information where it's easy to just accept what we see and hear. Socrates reminds us to be careful, to think critically, to talk to people who see things differently.
So we've looked at his life, his method, his big ideas. But what about his impact? How did his thinking affect those who came after him? Why is he still so important today in a world so different from his?
Now, that's a question worthy of its own discussion. We're going to explore the amazing legacy of Socrates in the final part of our journey. We've explored the man, his methods. Now we have to tackle his legacy. And it's a big one, reaching way beyond just philosophy, affecting how we think, how we understand the world.
This guy condemned to death over 2,000 years ago, and we're still talking about him, still learning from him. It's pretty wild when you think about it.
It really is. He's often called the father of Western philosophy, and you can see why. His focus on reason, on ethics, on knowing yourself, it laid the groundwork for so much that came after him.
So even though he didn't write anything himself, his fingerprints are all over the history of ideas.
That's the power of ideas, right? They can outlive us, ripple through time, affect people generations later. Think about all the big philosophical schools that came after Socrates. Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, the Stoics, the Cynics. They all have roots in his thinking, even if they went in different directions.
It's like he gave them the starting blocks, the big questions, and then they took it from there, building their own intellectual structures.
A great analogy. Take Plato, for example. He was hugely influenced by Socrates' emphasis on reason and pursuing knowledge, but he went on to develop his own complex system, the theory of forms.
That whole idea of perfect forms existing in some other realm, our world, just a shadow of that. It's mind-blowing, but also kind of confusing. Makes you wonder, what is real? Anyway,
And then you have Aristotle, Plato's student, who took a more grounded approach, focused on observing the world around us. But even with their differences, both Plato and Aristotle were wrestling with questions that Socrates first posed. How should we live? How do we know what we know? What's the nature of reality?
it's pretty incredible, isn't it? Two of the biggest names in philosophy, coming from different angles, but both shaped by this one guy who mostly taught through conversations.
And it wasn't just those big names either. The Cynics, they took Socrates' ideas about virtue and simplicity to the extreme, rejecting possessions, rejecting social norms, like ancient minimalists, living off the grid, challenging everyone's values.
It sounds like they were quite the characters. But it shows how different parts of Socrates' thinking could be taken up and spun into whole new ways of life.
And his influence wasn't limited to the ancient world. He popped up again and again throughout history. In the Middle Ages, Islamic scholars were really into Socrates, seeing him as a kindred spirit, someone who valued ethics and knowledge just like them.
That's pretty amazing to think of his ideas reaching that far, crossing cultures and centuries.
It shows how universal those ideas are. Seeking knowledge, trying to be good, reflecting on yourself. Those are things that speak to people across time and place.
Definitely. And then during the Renaissance, you have humanist thinkers rediscovering Socrates, holding him up as a model of reason and civic responsibility. He became a symbol of intellectual freedom, encouraging people to challenge dogma, to question authority.
It's like his ideas were dormant for a while, then burst back onto the scene with renewed energy, shaping that whole era.
Shows you how powerful his message was. Even today, in our super-fast, tech-driven world, his ideas still resonate.
Absolutely. Critical thinking, examining your own beliefs, searching for truth. These are more important than ever now, with all the information overload and everyone stuck in their own echo chambers. Socrates reminds us to step back, question what we see, talk to people who disagree with us.
It's like he's handing us a guidebook for navigating this crazy modern world, urging us to be active thinkers, not just passive absorbers of whatever comes our way.
And maybe that's his biggest legacy of all. Understanding that a life well lived is a philosophical one. It's about constantly questioning, searching, having the courage to challenge yourself and your beliefs, to be humble and open to truth.
So as we wrap up our journey with Socrates, we're left with this question. What would it mean to apply his method to your own life? How would it change the way you talk to people, make decisions, see the world?
Imagine having those tough but rewarding conversations with your loved ones, your colleagues, where you really push each other to think deeper, challenge assumptions, and find a better understanding.
It's an invitation to embrace that same spirit of inquiry that Socrates embodied. Who knows? Maybe in doing so, you'll discover some truths about yourself and the world that you never expected. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of the life, thought, and enduring legacy of Socrates.